Two things we want to talk about regarding Democrats. The first is this interview that we haven't talked about that was done by the senior officials on the Harris campaign with the Pod Save America podcast, which was an interesting venue choice since that podcast was very critical of the campaign. Dan Pfeiffer conducted the interview. And amongst those, many Democrats criticizing their failure to admit apparently any mistakes was someone named, a lawyer named Ben Yellen. Let's put up 101, please. So just show you some of the tweets that Mr. Yellen put up last week as he was listening to the interview. Somewhere between disappointing and enraging. I would not hire these guys. 102, please. Defensive. We did great. You still lost. Number 103, please. The more I listen to it, the worse it gets. Fully discrediting. Every 5 minutes, they reference the fact the campaign was short. They didn't have enough time. All right. To paraphrase the great Alvy Singer, we happen to have Ben Yellen right here. Please bring Mr. Yellen in. Ben Yellen, tell folks what your relationship is to the Democratic Party. Are you a Democrat? Are you a independent? What are you? There you go.
I'm a Democrat. I'm a partisan Democrat who was.
All right. Thank you for being here. And you voted for Kamala Harris.
I sure did.
And you're a lawyer in private practice, and you teach law?
I am. I do legal consulting, and I am an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Law School.
Happy holidays to you. Really grateful to you for joining us. Explain just in totality why you found that interview to be so not good.
I thought that this was an opportunity after you lose an election like this to really have some introspection, to look at what went wrong. There are some big questions in terms of policy, what went wrong with things like blue state governance, and there are a lot of good people in Democratic politics who are looking at those bigger questions. And what was so frustrating to me about this is these individuals who were working on the campaign were in position to have the most information out of any of us. They saw all of the data, they were there, but all they gave us was defensiveness, self-righteousness, excuse making. It reminded me a lot of the Chicago Bears coach, if anybody saw what happened with them last week, where they made this terrible error at the end of the game that cost them the victory. And they interviewed the coach, who was fired the next day. And he was like, well, we ran the play we wanted to run, and it just didn't work out. And it's just not an acceptable answer after a campaign like that. And I think it's a missed opportunity to have some real introspection.
Yeah. Ben, stay with us and chime in. Dan, I've described the people in that interview not as all-stars, but as Hall of Famers. And Ben says they should never work on a campaign again or never be hired again. What say you?
Yeah, I think there's three parts to this. There's the campaign, the party, and the candidate. I think on the campaign side, well, let me just cut to the chase. What hangs over the whole entire interview is the candidate.
They never blame her once.
No, and when they
to the contrary, they talk about how great she is.
Yeah, and when they say like the incumbent was really unpopular and we did everything we could to differentiate, but then it's like, oh, by the way, she didn't really want to try to differentiate on anything specific. The trans ad, which they spend 30 minutes on, they tie themselves in a pretzel saying, well, it didn't actually move any undecided voters, but then, oh, by the way, it made her seem out of touch. And David Plouffe says it's in her own effing words. Like, okay, she didn't want to separate from the candidate. She is incredibly liberal. She was not good in interviews. They basically say, oh, we did tons of interviews, but nobody talked. And they're like, we're trying to define ourselves. We're trying to, but she couldn't really speak in the interview. She couldn't really put points on the board. And so I just found that, and look, I get it. They're not going to come on and be like, our candidate sucked and we're great. But I think, to Ben's point, there's no admission of anywhere that the campaign made mistakes. And there is just no discussion of the candidate. And I think as we talk about the future and her possibly running again, to me, it's like it's horrifying that the party kind of doesn't want to just talk about her performance as a candidate when we look to the future.
Sean.
Yeah, I mean, your point earlier, Mark, the venue that they chose, you went on a podcast that was extremely critical, and then you didn't answer the fundamental questions. And the whole thing sounded, really looked awkward. And I think that that Ben's take on it was probably the take of most Democrats who found it tone deaf. I agree with everything that Dan said.